Hello, everyone. Welcome to the fifth program in our Outlander Highlands to Carolina series, Outlander Kitchen, a culinary journey through time with Theresa Carle-Sanders. We're glad you're here and hope that you've enjoyed the first four programs and are as excited as we are for tonight's entry. I'm Jake, and I'm here with Aaron and Heidi and Rebecca in the background, and we're all librarians with Wake County Public Libraries right here in North Carolina's capital county and capital city. You guys all know the drill by now. We're going to turn the chat off for a minute while we run through some housekeeping, but we'll turn it back on for the program. Our program tonight is 1 hour with time for questions at the end, time permitting. Captions or transcripts from Zoom are available during the program. You can toggle those on and off as you wish using the button on the Zoom toolbar or the bottom of your screen. We're recording this, and you'll get the link to where the recording will live in the post-program email. You can also keep an eye on the website for the series. We post the recorded programs under their respective tabs once they've been processed. Visit our webpage to learn everything about the series, this program, the presenter, and more. You can also sign up for any remaining programs in case you haven't done that yet. Any information gathered tonight will be put on the website and also go out in our post-program email. You know how that works. Lastly, please use the chat feature to post questions or to chat with us or each other. We've got the questions that you submitted when you registered. Take a second and set your chat audience to everyone, so any questions you do ask of us will make sense when we answer them. If you don't want to be distracted by the chat, you can turn the chat off in the chat previews by toggling the chat icon on the bottom of the screen on the Zoom toolbar. We know not everyone enjoys the chat, and that's okay. Next up in the series, we've got Andy the Highlander and a fantastic program about pirates off the coast of North Carolina. We'll put links to the registration in that post-program email if you haven't signed up yet. But do make sure that you get signed up because those programs will fill up fast. Coming up in the new year, we've got some great culinary virtual programming. We've got a rotisserie chicken program with me, where I will show you how to make a couple of different meals from one store-bought rotisserie chicken. And we'll have the wonderful Leslie Goddard, a historian, talking about the 10 most influential cookbooks in American history. And registration for those, the links to registration for those programs will also be in that post-program email. Do take a minute to take our post-program survey. We really value the feedback that you give us when you take this survey. Our library administration likes to hear about how people are enjoying the programs that we're putting on, virtual or in person. And if you'd like to see more programs like this, please make sure you do let them know. Thank you very much. Theresa Carle-Sanders is a trained cook and recipe writer born and raised in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada. After a brief career in corporate management, Theresa went back to culinary school, and she now combines a lifelong devotion to food and books to create cookbooks inspired by fiction, including Outlander Kitchen, the official Outlander companion cookbook, and Outlander Kitchen to the New World and Back Again. Also, Castle Rock Kitchen, Wicked Good Recipes from the World of Stephen King, and most recently, the In Death Cookbook, which came out last month and is inspired by the J.D. Robb futuristic police procedural series featuring Lieutenant Eve Dallas and her thief-turned-businessman husband, Rourke. Welcome, Theresa.
Thank you so much, Jake, and thank you for having me. It's good to be here, and welcome to everybody from around the world. Thanks so much for joining us tonight. I'm thrilled to go back to the beginning of my cookbook origins. It's hard to believe that it's been 16 years since I started Outlander Kitchen, and many of you have included some questions for me when you registered, and I've worked some of those into this presentation for tonight. And then I'm hoping and I'm certain that we'll have time for some more after that. Oh, there it is. I'm just going to share my screen and we'll get going. There we go. There we go. So welcome to Outlander Kitchen, a culinary journey through time. Outlander Kitchen has changed my life. Outlander changed my life. I've met Outlander fans from all over the world, some of whom have become lifelong friends. Those people in the picture there are my recipe testers. So they've been with me for all 4 books that I've written, starting with Outlander Kitchen, and they test every recipe I write to make sure that they work so that when you buy the books, the recipes all work. I've gone on to write Outlander Kitchen 2 after that, and then moved on after that, as Jake just said, to Castle Rock Kitchen, which features stories from Maine, written by Stephen King. And then there's the In-Depth Cookbook by J.D. Robb, also known as Nora Roberts. That's a really fun cookbook. Check it out if you're a fan of that series. I am a professional cook and a lifelong reader. I first discovered the Outlander series in 2001 after abandoning a fascinating career in package delivery management. Outlander opened my heart and my mind after years of stagnation. My husband and I moved from our home in Vancouver to a small island off the coast in between Vancouver and Victoria called Pender Island. You'll see it in the middle picture there. We lived there for 18 years, and we found joy in forging a new path away from the big city and its grind. That was 2003 when we moved to Pender. And in 2007, my father died rather suddenly from an unexpected illness. And he was a big part of my life and the reason for the special interest in cooking that I've always had. I think he'd always wanted me to be a chef, and I'm pretty sure he secretly dreamed of the two of us owning a restaurant together. But that didn't happen. And so eventually, through my grief, I realized the best way to honor his life and to find my true calling was to go back to culinary school. So that's what I did in 2008. And I lived in Vancouver during the week, where I went to the Pacific Institute of Culinary Arts. And I lived with my mom, and then went back to Pender for the weekends to see the dog and, of course, Howard, my husband. I returned to Pender when schooling was done, and that's where I started working in all the island restaurants. And I baked morning buns, those things in the middle there, and a lot of bread for farmers market. I also started my very first food blog called Island Vittles. Outlander Kitchen was born late in 2010 on a walk in the woods with Coda, the dog, our dog. From nowhere, a scene in Voyager popped into my head. It's just after Claire has been reunited with Jamie in the print shop in Carfax Close. They are in Madame Jean's, deciding what to do next, when Claire bites into a roll filled with minced pigeon and truffles. In a forest full of Douglas firs and red cedar, I could smell those freshly baked stuffed rolls. My mouth watered. I became a woman possessed, and the dog and I hurried home, where I wrote down some rough recipe notes and drafted an email to Diana Gabaldon via her Canadian representative, requesting permission to use the excerpt from Voyager on a blog post, sharing the recipe for my very first food from fiction. Diana responded the very next day with her surprise at the idea, but most importantly, her permission. And her permission and support has never wavered since that first response. I'm so grateful to her. I posted the recipe for pigeon rolls with truffles on my Island Vittles blog, and Diana graciously shared them on her social media. The response was so good, we did it again, this time with Brianna's Bridies from Drums of Autumn. Book fans loved the recipes and how they brought them closer to their favorite series. But the Outlander fandom pre-Stars adaptation wasn't ready. The concern was that the fandom wasn't big enough to support the publication of an entire cookbook. So, as you do, I started another food blog, this one, outlanderkitchen.com, to prove that there was a market for a cookbook. And that began probably the most creative portion of my life. Purely historical recipes, modern adaptations, character-inspired recipes. I made them all, and I published 1 or 2 recipes a week for 2 years. Oh, my patient husband. He was very, very patient. But then in mid-2013, Starz announced that they had picked up the series for adaptation to TV. The resulting storm swept me along with it, and I found myself at the San Diego Comic-Con for the 2014 premiere, sneaking around the back of the red carpet for a chance to talk to someone from Starz. I found someone, and from that connection, I was invited to write themed menus, like the one you see in the right-hand corner, for the Outlander premiere on Starz in August of 2014. I also created a themed recipe for each episode in that first season. So with Starz and Diana sharing these, soon my audience had grown, and there the publishers were now convinced a cookbook would sell. So here's our first question from the audience. Have you tried preparing traditional foods of Outlander in the methods used in those time periods? I sure did. That's what I started off doing. Purely historical recipe adaptations. Jocasta's old country bannocks, ragout pork, peppery oyster stew, cherry bounce, cockaliki soup. Those are some of the good ones that made it through the test of time and of our palates. But when you set out to answer the question, what would Jamie eat? You quickly discover that much of what they ate back then is just not going to work in the 21st century. Not only because of our taste buds have changed, but also the amount of time the modern cook has or wants to spend in the kitchen has changed. Another question was, how did I go about researching food and cooking in the 18th century? I used 3 historical cookbooks for the most part. The first is Mrs. McClintock's Receipts for Cookery and Pastry Work, which was published in 1736, and it is it's Scotland's first published cookbook. The next was published in 1747, and it's The Art of Cookery Made Plain and Easy by Hannah Glass. That's an English cookbook. And then to round it all off, American Cookery by Amelia Simmons from 1790. It says 1796, but it was first published 1792. There are a number of historical cookbooks available for free on Google Books. And that's, if you're interested in purely historical cooking, that's where I would start. Some of these cookbooks can get very expensive when you're buying them, so Google Books is a great place to start. And the last question, with cookbooks in mind, what is the best guidance for interpreting and adapting 18th century receipts for 2025? Well, let's have a look inside Receipts for Cookery by Mrs. McClintock. Hopefully you can see it. I'm going to ask you to have a look at to make a hare pie, which is on the left, recipe 25. You'll see that recipes are a lot shorter in historical cookbooks and they don't contain a lot of detail. Historical cookbooks assume the cook has a certain skill and knowledge level. They are not targeted towards beginner cooks. So it can be confusing when you start. A number of the words are spelled differently, as you can see, or they're no longer in use. So you need to have your Google open for help. And as with a modern cookbook, I always suggest reading the recipe through at least once before you start. And in the case of these historical ones, you may want to write it out in your own handwriting or type it out so that you know exactly what's going on. For example, to make a hare pie, cut the hare in collops, season it with pepper, salt, nutmeg, cloves, break all her bones, and lay the hare in the pie. So this is where we learn that we should probably have a crust made, right? But there's no crust in pie because, again, they assume if you're making a pie, you know how to make a crust and you know how to roll it out and all those things. You put some slices of bacon on the top of it, if you please. But if you keep out the bacon and put in currants and raisins and wait for it, a pound of butter on top, then that gives you 2 ways to make this pie in one very short paragraph. And then it has you make a liquor that you would pour in. So once the pie is baked and out of the oven, you would then pour the liquor that they're described over on the right-hand side into the pie and let it sit and cool. And that's where you get that sort of nice jelly that is often found in English pies or Scottish pies, Great British pies. Clare sums up the state of food in the 18th century very well in this quote from Drums of Autumn. "The food was either terribly bad or terribly good," Clare had said, describing her adventures in the past. "That's because there's no way of keeping things. Anything you eat has either been salted or preserved in lard, if it isn't half rancid, or else it's fresh off the hoof or out of the garden, in which case it can be bloody marvelous." So, with those considerations in mind, I made the decision early on to have fun and play with the concept of time travel. Outlander Kitchen is not a Scottish cookbook, nor is it a historical one. It's an Outlander cookbook, meaning we have 2 centuries and several different countries' cuisines to explore, along with a diverse cast of characters, many of whom scream their inspiration to me from the pages of Diana's cookbooks. These are some of my character-inspired recipes. Old Ian's buttered leeks, Stephen Bonnet's salted chocolate pretzel balls, Black Jack Randall's lavender fudge, Leary's whiskey sour, and of course, Mr. Willoughby's coral knob. And that sounds a lot more fun, and I know it was because I've spent 16 years doing it. It's a lot more fun to my 21st century book geek self than attempting the traditional recipe for Pau Saudi, which is found on the buffet table for Flora MacDonald's visit to River Run in A Breath of Snow and Ashes. The recipe starts out much like any other number of dishes from the period and involves scalding a freshly procured sheep's head in boiling water before scraping out its nostril hairs with a spoon. The last main category of recipes in Outlander Kitchen are the ones I modernized. I did this for a number of reasons, depending on the dish in question. The reasons include to improve the taste or to make it more recognizable to our modern expectations, to speed up the preparation, and to convert it to modern ingredients and or kitchen appliances. Fiona's cinnamon scones are a good example. The ones that come out of her kitchen in the 1980s would have been very different from those that came from the 18th century of Mrs. Fitz at Castle Leoch, if she was lucky enough to find wheat flour. Drunken mock turtle soup is another. That's a big recipe from Voyager for Outlander fans, and there's just no way I was going to convince most of you, or any of you, I think, to cook a turtle, even if you could find one. So instead, I took inspiration from Alice in Wonderland's mock turtle soup and went from there, including almost a full bottle of sherry. Interestingly, turtle soup was the recipe I had the most problems with. It took several attempts to get it right, which means a few bottles of sherry. And it takes 2 days to make it. So I always say it's worth it, but it's a big undertaking. Another question I got was, what's my favorite recipe from Outlander Kitchen? And I find that one really tough to answer. Tastes change with the seasons and they evolve over time. But I have to say, over 10 years of Outlander Kitchen, the recipe I crave the most, especially in the cool months of late fall and early spring, is Cullen skink. It's not got the greatest name, but it's a light fish chowder that is so tasty, and it's made from haddock that is cold smoked over peat. It's full of flavor and makes the perfect supper when served with oatcakes or Mrs. Bug's biscuits. Another question was, is there a recipe I regret not including in my cookbooks? There's at least two, and they're both historical dishes. One is salt rising bread on the right there. That's a unique yeastless bread that relies on bacteria for leavening, and it has a distinctive cheese-like aroma and flavor. It's not everybody's favorite, but it was very, very popular across central and southern Appalachian states. And it is mentioned at least once in Diana's books. The second, the reason I didn't include it was it's a method more than a recipe, and it's finicky and it's very hard to get consistent. And it just, there's no way I could distill it down into 2 or 3 pages in a cookbook. I did do a blog post about it, but unfortunately that's long gone. But if you're interested, Google Mary's Nest salt rising bread, and I found she's got a very long involved post that will explain it to you. Quail baked in clay is the other dish that didn't make the cookbook. Again, basically because it was just too hard to distill it down into a couple of pages, but you can see the pictures I took there. I had a great time making it. You need some food safe clay. I wrapped those quail in leek to protect them a little bit and give them some extra flavor. And I took the backbone out of them. You can see them with their cross legs there. And then wrap them up tightly in clay. Make sure there aren't any air pockets, because that's when you get trouble. Things explode in an open fire if there's air pockets in the clay. And they're very, very tasty. Lots of bones, so you got to pick through it. But it was a fun evening around an outside fire when we had those. And then I think another really interesting thing that most people don't know about the cookbook is I've got the Polish cover in the middle there. And then below it is actually the original picture that was taken for the cover. So you can see they have colorized the napkin in the basket differently. They've replaced the corn muffins with jam tarts, and they've changed the color of the dress. The photographer desperately tried to get a red dress, but she couldn't. She could only get a blue one. So they colorized that one as well. And I always think that's a cool story, because most people don't realize that you can do that kind of thing to photos and covers, and no one would ever know, but no one would ever know. The first Outlander Kitchen was published in 2016, and Outlander Kitchen 2, To the New World and Back Again, was published in 2020. Outlander Kitchen is published in Polish, in German, and in French. And the 2 books together have sold over 130,000 copies. So thank you to everyone who has a copy. There's Diana and I. That's the first time I met her at the Surrey Writers Festival. I think it's probably 2011. And you can see how we've changed and how the years have gone by. And then in the middle there is the bookstore in Scottsdale, where Diana sells all of her signed books out of. We sat together in one afternoon after the publishing of Outlander Kitchen and signed 2,000 copies. And then that's us having a glass of wine after we signed all those 2,000 copies. I don't know how she does it, but she signs a lot of books very, very quickly. I thought a number of you would also be interested in more of the actual history surrounding the food and its place in the Outlander series. Diana has 2 outlandish companions, and when she was writing the second one, she asked me to include to write an essay that she could include at the back of the book. So the rest of this presentation is a shortened version of that essay entitled The Diet and Cookery of 18th Century Highlanders. Prior to the loss at Culloden and the resulting clearances that forced tens of thousands of people from the land and left it as one of the least densely populated areas in all of Europe, the Scottish Highlands were home to a much larger population, mostly tenant farmers living in small collective groups of crofts called townships. These townships typically housed 100 people, often an extended family, who grew, raised, foraged, and, if near the water, fished to survive amongst the North's unforgiving landscape with its short growing season, harsh climate, and poor soil. The typical diet of a Highland Scot through the first half of the 18th century varied widely, according to their place in the economic and social structure. The tables of the great halls in castles such as Leoch and the dining rooms of manor homes such as Lallybroch were laden with venison and wild boar, beef and lamb, fowl and songbirds. They had imported delicacies in their storerooms, dried fruit, citrus peel, expensive spices like pepper, cloves, and cinnamon. Sugar, still a very expensive commodity in the early 18th century, was used to make sumptuous desserts and puddings. They drank beer brewed on their estates, as well as whiskey, and enjoyed fine wines from Europe's best grape-producing regions. And then someone asked what 2 or 3 spices or ingredients would be my timeless must-haves. So the first on the left there is long pepper. That's the first pepper that they brought back from the Spice Islands. It's got a much deeper flavor than black pepper, and I really enjoy using it in all sorts of dishes, but particularly curries, where that extra flavor really stands out. My next one, a lot of people think they don't like it. It's nutmeg. But nutmeg is very important in historical cooking, and it plays a big role in developing flavor. The number one thing you need to remember about nutmeg is you should never buy pre-ground nutmegs. You should always buy little nutmegs, not pre-ground ones. There's no flavor in the pre-ground stuff. And number 2, if you can taste it in the finished dish, you've used too much. So next time you make it, back off a little bit. It's an undercurrent of a flavor. It's not something that should be pronounced. And then my third ingredient is cream. There's no substitute for good old-fashioned high-fat whipping cream. You can make butter out of it. You can make cheese out of it. You can make ice cream out of it. You can make so many things. So the 3 of them together probably wouldn't make a great dish, but they'd certainly be the perfect starting point from which to make a great dish. The diet of the poorer classes, in contrast, was a much leaner, plain, and monotonous one. Bannocks, oatcakes, porridge, and vegetable pottages, very occasionally enriched with a small piece of meat or a bone, made up the bulk of a farmer's diet. Meat was expensive and eaten rarely. Farmers grew crops of oats, barley, and peas at a subsistence level and raised animals, particularly cattle, primarily for milk, butter, and cheese. Wheat for leavened bread wouldn't grow on the poor, unimproved soil, and there was no oven in a farmer's croft in which to bake it. Kitchen gardens, or kale yards, supplemented farmers' families' diets with year-round crops of kale, leeks, and other vegetables hardy enough to survive a Highland winter. So ubiquitous was kale that it became associated with everything food, from the family vegetable plot to the dinner bell. You can see the little, I'm not going to try and read it in Scots, but there's a great little poem using the kale bell. and then all of the other words that mean kale yard. It's a market garden. It's a small kitchen garden. Mustard, spinach, carrots, and cabbage from the garden provided welcome variety in a crofter's diet from summer through early winter. The hardest time of the year was after the failing of the previous winter's kale crop in early spring, through until the first harvest in early summer. Food stores were near bare between those times. Foraged wild vegetables such as nettles, sorrel, and wild garlic filled the food gap and provided much needed nourishment to fuel the plowing and planting activities of spring. Near the shores, most men split their time between the fields and the seas. These fishermen farmers had the most varied, nutrient-rich diet of the Highlands working poor, thanks to plentiful fish and seafood. They used seaweed to fertilize their gardens and made salt to season and preserve their food, as well as to barter with the inland population. Across the Highlands, food from the working man was required to be easily transportable and resistant to spoilage. Men would commonly carry a bag of oatmeal in their sporran, which could quickly be made into a basic porridge or oat cake while in the field or away from home. This type of food to go is thought to account for the origins of haggis, which we see on the right there. But it's important to note that the first printed reference to that eminently Scottish dish is from an English cookbook, and it most likely extends back much further to the Viking occupation of Britain. Crofts were sturdy, small, windowless homes built to shelter their inhabitants from the ruthless conditions in the Highlands. Just inside the single door, used by both animals and humans, was a sunken room with a cobbled floor called the byre, where the animals, mostly cattle and chickens, were kept, along with the farmer's foot plow and his wife's milk churn. Up a step from the byre was the croft's center section, which served as the family's living room, dining room, kitchen, and bedroom. The floor was packed dirt. The walls were made of thickly cut turf of clay and with thickly cut turf or clay and wattle. The roof was thatched in whatever was available: heather, broom, straw, or rushes. The peat fire in the center of the living room burned day and night to provide light and warmth. The family sat around the fire on low wooden stools where the smoke was not as thick, and if there was fish, they were hung above the fire to smoke. An opening in the roof was offset from the fire to allow smoke to escape, but the walls and roof were covered with black ash from the fire. And they actually used that. They scraped the black ash off the walls and the roof, and they used it as fertilizer in the fields, which may have improved the soil enough to get good crops of oats. Cooking equipment and utensils were very basic, and cooking was a necessary chore that held none of the creative appeal seen in today's ergonomic and sanitary kitchens. The woman of the house prepared and cooked her family's meals from her perch on the end of her stool, with only the dim fire to light her efforts, unless the family could afford an oil-burning rush lamp for additional lighting. The cast iron girdle or griddle was nestled into the ashes of the fire and used to bake bannocks and oat cakes. The kettle, which you can see in that middle picture, the kettle for cooking the family's porridge and pottage was either balanced on top of the fire or hung just above it from a chain attached to the ceiling. The pot was perpetually filled morning to night with the family's next meal, bubbling away unobserved while the woman of the house completed the rest of her exhaustive list of chores, including the backbreaking work of fetching water for cooking and cleaning, as well as hauling and stacking the peat cut by the men in the fields to ensure a constant supply of fuel for the fire. In stark contrast to the dim picture painted of the crofter's living space and cooking area were the large. Say hello to Douglas, everybody. That's my dog. In stark contrast to the dim picture painted of the crofter's living space and cooking area were the large, sometimes vast kitchens in clan castles and large homes, which were generally housed on the building's lowest level and equipped with at least one major hearth and chimney. The inventory of large equipment would have included a brick oven beside the hearth for baking, as well as a stew hole, which is on the left, in the wealthiest and most up-to-date kitchens. The stew hole was a raised, freestanding structure that allowed the cook to stand instead of sitting or crouching at the hearth. A fire was built in the base, and pots were set over grates over the fire to cook or to keep things warm. In addition to iron kettles and girdles, the list of small equipment would likely have included spits to turn the meat and fowl, copper and clay pots, a variety of knives, tongs, ladles, mallets, all designed to make the preparation of modern, more refined foods faster and easier. Defeat at Culloden saw the systematic destruction of the clan system and a need for cash to satisfy the demands of the King's Court in London. Tenant farmers who had paid their rent with labor and goods in kind for generations now found themselves unable to come up with the coin their landlords demanded. Over subsequent decades, the majority of the land was enclosed for grazing and often entire townships evicted to make room for more profitable sheep. The more fortunate evictees were relocated to the cities of Edinburgh and Glasgow, while the less fortunate were transported to faraway colonies such as Australia and North America, most never to see their homeland again. Many of the poor that arrived on America's Atlantic shores moved into the backcountry, including wilderness areas of North Carolina, like the fictional Fraser's Ridge. To begin, their diet remained based primarily on boiled grains and vegetable stews, although they quickly adapted to incorporate a number of locally grown ingredients such as corn, beans, squash, collards. Collards are a close cousin to kale. Potatoes, which were still new to the first immigrants forced from the highlands, became an important staple. The lush natural larder of their new home also regularly provided small game and birds, resulting in a much more varied and nutritionally complete diet for all. Hogs were relatively simple and low cost to raise. They were released into the woods as young shoats to run wild until they matured, just like the white sow on Fraser's Ridge. Eventually, much of North Carolina and surrounding colonies' diets were based on pork and corn, with the average person consuming 5 pounds of pork for every pound of beef. This hog and hominy diet stretched all across all levels of society, with the wealthiest consuming the choicest cuts of the animal and leaving their workers and slaves what remained. All parts of the animal were consumed or repurposed, and the diet was supplemented with collard greens and cabbage. As they had been at home in the highlands, smoking and salting were the primary means used to preserve meats and fish. Potted meat, the process of sealing cooked meat in fat, was another common technique. Hogs were never slaughtered in the summer, and their meat was seldom eaten fresh, except after a large slaughter, where giant smoking pits, like the one on the right, would be dug, and people were invited for miles around to join the feast. The great tradition of Southern barbecue originates from these early gatherings. In their new home, fruits and vegetables were dried and pickled, then packed in fresh straw to sit alongside cheese and barrels of salted meat, as well as cider and beer in the cool air of small underground house cellars. In cold seasons, fresh meat was also stored for short periods of time. Access to cheap sugar, which is on the left, that's a cone of sugar from the 18th century. Access to cheap sugar for centuries so costly as to be out of reach for all but the very rich meant that everyone could now afford to make puddings, custards, and other sweet treats regularly. The imposition of heavy taxes also resulted in dietary changes. Molasses-based rum was replaced with liquor made from locally grown corn. And coffee rose in popularity as the supply of tea dried up, leading to the American Revolution. Maple syrup would have been harvested where cold enough, and honey was collected. As Claire has her bees, other immigrants would have kept bees as well for sweetness. The settlers' wooden back countries were small. However, they included a fireplace with a hearth and a chimney, which was an improvement over a Crofts centrally located fire on the floor. In larger houses, the kitchen was often separated from the house to keep the heat, smells, and staff far away from the living quarters and guests. These kitchens contained the basic equipment and tools found as the same equipment and tools as found in backcountry cabins, but they were of better made and higher quality materials. The other large feature of a wealthier kitchen, including those of the burgeoning middle class, such as merchants and tradesmen, was the presence of a bread oven, either beside the hearth or outside the house. Baking was an all-day affair undertaken once per week. The baker rose early to prepare her dough and light the fire within the oven. Once the fire had reduced to ashes, the oven floor was swept clean and the loaves and pies placed inside, with the help of a long wooden or cast iron peel. The oven door was then closed and the contents left to bake. It was often well after dark when a day's baking was finally done, and the meals on those days were generally leftovers or simple stews that could be left to cook unattended. Dinner was the main meal of the day, served in early afternoon. A typical wealthier family in the 1700s served 2 courses for dinner. The first included soups, meats, savory pies, pancakes and fritters, and a wide variety of sauces, pickles, and ketchups. Desserts appeared with the second course, which included an assortment of fresh, cooked, or other dried fruits, custards, tarts, and sweetmeats. Salats or salads were more popular for supper, a light meal served just before bed. The life of an 18th century Highland crofter was one of constant toil and strife. The workday was long and food was scarce. And while their relocation to the Americas resulted in death for some and a cruel loss of country for thousands more, eventually, those who survived in the New World adopted a life of continuing hard work, but with greater food and nutritional reward. The increase in protein and a variety of diet undoubtedly fueled many Highlanders' rise from crushing poverty and their contribution to the fight for their new nation's independence. And that is it from me. I'm going to unshare now, if I can get it to unshare. Am I back? Should be up.
Let's see.
Am I there? Now
there we go. Now we get.
Sorry, everybody.
We got it. We're great. And we're back. That was great. So much good information in there.
A lot of information. So it takes a while sometimes to let it all settle in. But if people have questions, I'd love to talk to them about them.
There were certainly a couple of questions that bubbled up. Some of them a few times. So there's some good stuff in there. One of the questions was sort of, I thought was sort of interesting. There's somebody asked about Perrick, mentioned in the books, and they wonder if it is just the same thing as oatmeal or if it means something else.
No, it's just porridge. It's what we would call porridge. It's a Scots term, perrich.
And then the other question was, have you had a chance to prepare any of the dishes for Diana or for any of the cast and crew?
When I first met Diana, you saw a picture of it at the beginning of the presentation. I did. I took a glass jar of Stephen Bonnet's salted chocolate pretzel balls to her. Now, those are not historically accurate, but they did make her laugh. Um, and but other than that, I haven't had a chance to sit down. I've met a number of cast and crew from the show, but I haven't had a chance to cook for them. No.
What people wonder, what was your favorite food from the series that you developed?
Cullen skink is one, which is a light fish chowder, but I think Mrs. Bug's biscuits. There's some really classic dishes that are simple to prepare, and they've become sort of Outlander Kitchen classics. Fiona's cinnamon scones are another one. They're really popular at Christmas. I know a lot of people make them for Christmas morning, and that's what I do for Christmas morning.
There was a question I thought was interesting about, as you were doing your research, did you stumble across something that was sort of seemed surprisingly modern for way back then that is still being done today in much the same way? Or does it seem like, basically everything has progressed?
No, I don't think everything's progressed. I think some of the ways we cook some meals have changed a little bit. But there's, for example, a lot of people are surprised to hear that deep fat frying is a combination. We do a lot of it now. They didn't do it so much of it back then, and they always used lard. But what's interesting is it combined once people got to the States. People of African origin brought spices and things like that. And the Scots brought this tradition of deep frying chicken. So that's where that combination coming together is where we get Southern fried chicken. And it has evolved over time, but I bet if we went back and tasted it, it would be recognizable at least.
There was an interesting person mentioned in their chat that they had been trying to work through an 18th century cookbook with
Wow.
their family, and a lot of the recipes called for a kind of similar flavor profile using a lot of butter and nutmeg and cloves, which I guess her family did not particularly appreciate. And she was just sort of wondering if like that was I guess that laid heavy in that cookbook, but was that just because that style of cooking at that time only had a few spices?
What
And
was
then,
available.
yeah, and those spices were mostly to sort of disguise what could be questionable product.
What could definitely be rancid meat. I think we've sort of exaggerated that over the last couple of 100 years. I don't think that they were eating terribly rancid meat a lot of the time, except obviously the very poor. But the very poor wouldn't have had those expensive spices. So, but the spice covered was limited. It was cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, things like that, and now we have cumin and coriander, and those were certainly existed, but they weren't commonly used back then. So the flavor profiles are all very similar, which is why a lot of the time I end up adapting things to make them a little bit different from their historical origins.
There seems to be a lot of questions about vegetarians and vegans and how things could be adapted. And I wonder historically that's probably not a thing, right? I mean,
No.
most of the diet is going to be primarily forage, so lots of vegetarian options just to begin with, and very little meat eating, as seasoning.
Yeah.
But in your cookbooks, are other than the obvious replacements for, like a smart balance instead of butter or things like that,
Right.
are there other sorts of things that you think are easily adaptable for vegans and vegetarians in the cookbooks?
Particularly Outlander Kitchen 2 to the New World and Back Again. We played with that concept. So there are some more modern adaptations of dishes in there that includes gluten-free. I mean, there's a lot of gluten-free food historically, though, particularly in Scotland. They're not eating wheat, most of them. They're eating oats and barley. So depending on your gluten tolerance, barley can be a problem. But Outlander Kitchen 2 to the New World and Back Again has quite a few either vegetarian recipes or recipes that are easy to adapt. Vegan can get a little bit trickier, but again, I think there's a couple of vegan recipes in there even that use nutritional yeast and other things that they wouldn't have had back then, but that we thought it would be fun to play with in the second cookbook.
So I know writing from Canada sort of offers a small challenge in that we here in North Carolina know that the pawpaw is, our native fruit and would have been a pretty important source of sustenance for the Frasers as they're here. But I wonder if you've had any experience with pawpaws.
I've never had a pawpaw. No. No, thankfully Diana doesn't mention them in the book, so I haven't had to go looking. But I did. I think the most expensive thing I ever had to do was I was making marmalade for Outlander Kitchen 2, and I lived on a small island at that point. Anyway, I had to get a courier to go and get me the Seville oranges that were in season for a very short period of time. And I mean, it cost me those oranges. They were at least $10 a piece. Those oranges by the time it was done. But that's it's a really nice recipe. The marmalade is a really nice recipe.
Well, the secret to the best Seville orange marmalade is a product called Mamade that you can get in a can from England, and it's just shredded Seville orange strips.
Oh, hey, that would have been a lot easier.
Hey, call me next time. I'm full of these things. So there's questions about alcohol in here. People want to know a number of things like, have you tried to make whiskey, and what's your favorite beer, and all those sorts of things. Do you have any thoughts?
Whiskey, no, I'm not going to distill whiskey. I did go on a big whiskey tour in Scotland, though, in 2011. We went to a few different distilleries. I used every excuse in the book to drink a lot of alcohol while I was writing Outlander Kitchen. And my husband and I, we don't drink a lot of wine, but we do drink craft beer. And that comes from, he's English, so he's always had that love of beer, but mine definitely comes from years of drinking different beers while writing Outlander Kitchen.
Do you have a favorite recipe from your books, or maybe just outside of the books?
Outside,
I also dislike this question, but I do.
It's a hard one. It really puts people on the spot, especially when, I've written 450, 500 recipes over the last 15 years. So sometimes it's hard to remember them all. But I really enjoyed the process of making cherry bounce. I thought that was a ton of fun, and I learned a lot from it. I think, as I said, we eat mostly soups and things like that. And we still, a lot of the soups that we eat still come from Outlander Kitchen. The cockleekie is a really good winter staple around here. It's sweetened with prunes, which is traditional. It's historical. It throws a few people off, but it's actually a really nice taste.
We here in the States are staring down the barrel of Thanksgiving.
Yes.
Do you have any thoughts about what some of us might want to attempt for our Thanksgiving tables?
There's a lovely sweet potato pie in Outlander Kitchen, and there's a lovely turkey recipe in there too. Actually, a recipe for turkey. If you're going to go traditional and historical, then you'll find definitely some really great recipes for you in Outlander Kitchen 1 in particular. 2, again, we go back and forth. There's a really nice cornbread stuffing in number 2. You could definitely put a full traditional Thanksgiving meal together with both cookbooks for sure.
I love it. That's fantastic. Well, I think we've run through the list of questions really that have come through. There's I guess one more question that's about how people might want to incorporate the flavor that peat might have imparted into the foods that were cooked over peat,
Right.
and how much of a difference in taste that might have caused. But
Right.
that'll probably be our last question.
The the only peat smoked food I've ever had was in Scotland, and it's Finnan Haddie, which is a cold smoked haddock. Um, and they're very careful with how they use the peat because peat is really heavy. It's really heavy. So you have to be quite light with it. Personally, we don't have anything like peat that we can use in North America. So you're really best just using smoking chips, whatever your favorite wood is, hickory or pecan or apple. Any of those are really good.
Well, that's fantastic. I guess I said that was the last question, but one just popped through, and it's probably pretty important. But they really want you to say more about haggis.
Haggis. Okay. So was haggis was an accident. There's no doubt about it, and it was created by when before plastic bags we had to use something for bags. So they often used the stomach, and the stomach, if it wasn't dried properly, would still contain enzymes. And when they put the oats into it to carry around for an emergency meal, what happened was they fermented, they changed, and then over the course of many centuries, different things were added to it. They've chopped up all the organ meat in haggis and put it in. My mother loved haggis. She ate it every time she could. I'm not such a big fan of it. But I had some really great Indian pakoras made from haggis that I have to say were really delicious. But that's probably the most delicious form of haggis I've ever had.
It's funny, in Eastern North Carolina, there's a traditional food that's very similar to haggis called Tom Thumb, which
Oh,
is it's a pork stomach that's stuffed with a sausage made of pork bits and rice, and then it's sort of steamed until it
okay.
solidifies, just like a haggis.
Just like a haggis. A haggis is boiled in the bag and then they cut it open and off you go.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's funny how you use what you have, right?
It is. And when you grow up with organ meat and liver and things like that, then you're used to it. And haggis won't be such a big shift in taste for you. But for those of us that weren't exposed to a lot of organ meat, it can be tough. It can.
Sure. I really like it, but it's
There
just
you go, right? My husband likes it too. It's just not for me. But
fantastic. All right. Well, I think that is those are all the questions that we have.
cool.
Theresa, thank you very much for giving us such a great presentation. I think a lot of us learned a lot about, the inspiration behind your books and how you're sort of interpreting, this Outlander journey into some great recipes. And it's really exciting to see how you do that sort of thing. So thank you for the peek behind the curtain.
Well, thank you so much, Jake. It was really, really fun. I really enjoyed myself. And I'm just chuffed that so many people came out to listen. So thank you all for coming.
Well, folks, we do thank you for joining us. Be sure to click that survey link that we'll send in that post-program email if you weren't able to catch it before. We really do want to hear your feedback about how you're feeling about these programs. And we hope that we'll see you in future programs here at Wake County Public Libraries. As all of our virtual programs end kind of abruptly, we'll just end this meeting here in just a moment. But again, thank you very much for joining us, and we hope to see you again soon. Thanks
Thanks,
a lot.
everybody. Take care.